Good afternoon. Today we'll be discussing the book Right Where We Belong, How Refugee Teachers and Students Are Changing the Future of Education. Please note that chat is disabled for attendees. However, you may enter your questions into the Q&A feature, which will be active throughout the event. I would like to now pass it over to Vidor Chopra.
Thank you, Mayan. It is with utmost gratitude, honor, and respect that I now introduce today's book talk's author. At 12, when most young people are caught up in the latest fads, Sarah instead, for her English assignment, turned to look at the meaning of the word community, examining how much needs to be in common for there to be unity. Capacious and discerning in her capacities to ask big questions then and even now, in Right Where We Belong, Sarah asks, how do our schools and education institutions become sites of learning, sanctuary, and belonging? When all has been lost for individuals fleeing conflict, climate change, and economic collapse, can education be what is gained? Nurturing mentor, teacher of uncommon promise and flair, empathetic listener, proud Canadian, poignant story weaver, prolific scholar, and eternal optimist. Your book masterfully illumines the tenacity of refugee teachers, families, communities, and learners, engaging us to re-envision our shared moral and social commitments to one another in times of peril and crises. Your preoccupations with how refugees build and create home through education have equally informed your teaching and mentorship, captivating the hearts and minds of so many of your students, helping them make HGSE their intellectual homes. Sarah, your creativity, curiosity, and courageousness to examine not just what is, but what could potentially be have been critical in defining the contours of the field of refugee education. A bold trailblazer, may you continue using your many talents to lead us in creating a more just world. Friends and colleagues, please join me, Celia, and Zura in welcoming our teacher and HGSE's very own Dr. Sarah Dryden Peterson.
Oh my, thank you, Vidor. I talk so much in my work about this idea of weaving past, present, and future. And thank you for beautifully doing that in that introduction. And thank you all for being here today. It's really wonderful to share time together. You know, the idea of having conversations on big ideas that the book raises actually is designed to mirror a finding of the book, that enabling all refugee young people to learn, to experience a sense of belonging, and be prepared to build more equitable and just futures happens through dialogue, through collaboration, through co-creation. So in this way, my hope is that the launch of this book is not about what is, as Vidor said, in what is described, what's written on the page, but also these questions of what can be. So with this goal in mind, our time today is intentionally designed as a sharing of ideas and as a discussion. And I can think of no better comrades to engage in this discussion of big ideas in education with Vidor Chopra, Zora Faizi, and Celia Reddick, who you saw on the screen a moment ago and will have the pleasure of hearing from, and who I have had the joy of learning with over the past decade. So here's how our time together will take shape today. I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes about a big idea from the book, including reading some short sections from the book. Then Vidor, Zora, and Celia will each talk for about 5 minutes, sharing a big idea from their research. We'll then introduce each other as we go along. We'll pose questions to each other on some of the threads across our work before opening to your questions. You're able to put questions in the Q&A, as Mayan said, at any time, and we really look forward to them. I'm going to begin by reading from the beginning of the book. Our futures. Currently, 26.4 million people live as refugees, the equivalent of Australia or Texas or Delhi or Shanghai. In 2019 alone, 2.4 million people were newly displaced. That's 6,500 people each day, fleeing across a border to seek refuge. Almost half of these refugees are children. The number of refugees globally is growing, and all of our children's chances of experiencing unwanted displacement as a result of conflict and climate change are also increasing. Home for many refugees who are newly displaced is Syria, Venezuela, or Myanmar. They join millions more whose exile has spanned multiple decades, from 40 years of conflict in Afghanistan, 25 years in Democratic Republic of Congo, and 30 years in Somalia. These countries are not alone. In each year since 1990, between 40 and 68 countries, making up 46 to 79% of the world's population, have had armed conflict within and between their borders. Conflict and resulting displacement are widespread and global experiences. Once displaced, refugees now live in exile without permanent home for between 10 and 20 years, 3 times as long as in the early 1990s. While political solutions and peace remain elusive, millions of refugee children globally risk spending their entire childhoods as if in suspended animation, as if their futures are on hold. They are less likely to go to school. They are less likely to finish school. They are less likely to learn, and they are less likely to feel like they can contribute to their communities. What would it take to ensure that all refugee young people have access to learning that enables them to feel a sense of belonging and prepares them to help build more peaceful and equitable futures? This is the question that drives this book, the one that keeps me up at night, that motivates me each day. In this book, Right Where We Belong, I show that where we are now in answering and acting on this question is both discouraging and hopeful. In fact, as the book began to take shape, I drew the arc of it as a map. I just found my initial scribblings, and these are them, and realized it has both big soaring mountains and low places that are absolutely devastating. I chose the titles of the chapters to represent the places on this map. And I begin with teacher, up here, the first soaring mountain, as a kind of guidepost, as what I find across places and across time is that teachers are doing the daily and inspiring work of figuring out what it does take to equitably create quality education for refugees. After teacher, we then go pretty low. The next chapter is sanctuary. It's grim and it's unjust. 73% of refugees live in neighboring host countries. And this is confinement, with policies, borders, walls placed by high-income countries to intentionally keep refugees out. In 2017, 25% of the population in Lebanon was a refugee, compared to 0.1% in the United States. From sanctuary to power, we're still low here. Decisions about what refugees learn in school are generally made by powerful people far away, often driven by efficiency over the short term, one-size-fits-all approaches that, as one of our research participants said, are not addressing my needs as I grow up. From there to purpose, and we begin to climb the mountain from what seems the limits of what's possible with walls all around and short-term mindsets to a view of what teachers and students see as the purposes of education, future building. Part of this has been supported by a new approach to refugee education globally, formally since 2012, of including refugees in national schools rather than separate schools, as was historically the case. From purpose, then learning. Here we get higher still, but with some of a plateau. Often learning for refugees in national schools is circumscribed by unfamiliar languages and curriculum that feels irrelevant or harmful. But there's also learning that opens these rigid bounds of what is often learned in schools to connect it to histories and identities in home countries, to colonial, political, economic causes of conflict, and to practices of asking questions and explaining. From learning, then to belonging. Teachers who are able to build relationships with their students more readily see the need for this kind of learning, and they learn together with their students how to do it well. Individuals in classrooms come to see themselves as interconnected, Their own futures reciprocally wrapped up in those of people around them. And then we end up here, home. When a refugee must flee, the goal is almost never to leave home. The reality, as poet Washan Shire writes, is that home won't let you stay. And displacement is only fleetingly about the moment of arrival. It's about the weeks, months, and years when something new must be created. The arc of the book, teacher, sanctuary, power, purpose, learning, belonging, home. Across 23 countries and more than 600 interviews, I show that refugee teachers and students can and are reimagining refugee education in ways that can meet long-term purposes, focused on opportunity. Most importantly, they are doing this by finding ways to teach and learn that allow students to weave together their pasts, presents, and futures. This is a wish for education perhaps not dissimilar from parents in any part of the world, those forced to flee conflict, those marginalized in the places they call home, and those much more privileged. I'm going to read a section from the book about one such teacher, Jacques in Uganda. We walked for several kilometers off the main road and finally up a steep and rutted dirt path. It was the time of year of the flying ants, enswa, and together we walked through swirling clouds of these white insects and of children, home because they were unable to afford the hidden costs of school. They were watching and catching this once-a-year treat. Amid the glistening green banana leaves and the tall piles of trash and the shreds of plastic bags fluttering in the wind, we found the school and who I had been told about as the refugee teacher. We approached the door, a hole in a concrete wall. In each of the four corners of this otherwise hollow building, I saw children sitting in neat rows, listening intently to their teachers, raising their hands, talking with each other. Without walls or dividers, the teachers and students had, with their focus on each other, created small feeling classrooms in this wide open space. Jacques, obviously the head teacher, approached the doorway to greet his uninvited guests, while a teacher from the far classroom corner stepped in to teach Jacques' class. I'm skipping ahead here. Over the next 10 years, Jacques consistently demonstrated deep care for his students and acted unwaveringly to inspire their learning, to prepare them for their future lives, as he had once written in red ink on a plain sheet of white paper. In addition to his father, Jacques remembers two teachers important in his own life. The first was an old man by the name of Léonard, who answered every question his students asked. The second was Sidonie, a young woman from his community who also was a neighbor. Jacques explained how she fed all the children who lived nearby when they were hungry, and he recalled the loving way she had carried him once when his legs were too short and he could not walk through the deep mud. I could see these two teachers in Jacques as he interacted with his students. Jacques called every student by name. He made sure to hear the voice of every student during every lesson. This personalized attention is rare in refugee classrooms, as it is in the classrooms of his Democratic Republic of Congo home and across many low and middle income countries, where there are often more than 100 students in a single class. Instead of writing a list of vocabulary words on the sole fragment of chalkboard he had, Jacques wrote, "J'apprends du vocabulaire." I learn vocabulary, placing each student in the role of active learner. At the end of each lesson, Jacques said to his students, "Merci beaucoup pour aujourd'hui." Thank you for today. When I visited students' homes with him, he was welcomed as a respected teacher and as a friend. Through his teaching and interactions like these, Jacques explained that he had two goals for his students. First, that they learn to be part of life in Uganda for now. And second, that they learn what they need to know to prepare themselves for their futures. But where and what would these futures be? This is the question that Jacques was preoccupied with for himself and for his students. For himself, Jacques' preferred future was to return home to DRC. In one's own village, that is where one really feels at home, he said. It is a place where the future can be imaginable. But in the context of ongoing war and no rule of law, where you could be killed no matter when, for no matter what reason, any sort of predictable future of return was not possible. Jacques had come to the conclusion that home then is what he can build for himself, his students, and his children, wherever they are. When you become a refugee, you must begin to live here, Jacques said, pointing to the ground beneath him to emphasize that here is where one is from the moment you arrive. Refugee education has typically been framed with the goal of negative peace, the absence of direct violence. We see this historically in refugee education that was separate from nationals, as a kind of temporary holding ground to keep people safe until return, that Jacques describes as impossible, was possible. And we see it now in prevalent models of including refugees in national education systems that do support access, but without accompanying conditions for learning, belonging, and opportunity. But Jacques and other teachers help us think about how refugee education could be about positive peace, or the absence of structural violence. Positive peace is not only the absence of violence, but the conditions of the possibilities and the presence of conditions that allow individuals to access opportunities. When thinking about possibilities for positive peace, I really appreciate the ideas of social theorist Nancy Fraser, who outlines how access to equal opportunities requires redistribution to counter resource-based inequalities and recognition to counter identity-based inequalities. In education, redistribution to address resource-based inequalities can often happen through systems-level policies, as we see in the case of policies to include refugees in national education systems. Yet as I see across my work, addressing identity-based inequalities can be much more challenging to institutionalize, especially in settings where refugees do not have rights and national narratives of belonging do not include them. What I find is that possibilities of positive peace are connected to perceptions of refugees' futures. From research with refugee students across contexts, we see that they largely reject the notion that they can conceptualize their futures geographically and in terms of countries, which is of course how migration policies are conceptualized. While young people wish for more geographic certainty and more inclusive migration policies are essential, young people also pragmatically think through how little control they have over these kinds of policies. We learn from them a different way to conceptualize futures and thus purposes and experiences of education in terms of opportunities. This means capacities to apply what one learns across place and time, and not having to choose between the present and the future, between the kinds of learning that are deemed worthy within the education one experiences at the present in this particular geography, and the opportunities that might trade away for a reimagined future. To enable that, we need to focus on supporting refugee teachers and students to do this kind of learning, the kind that builds capacities to navigate, that allows for learning about here and there, and building new kinds of meaning, and also to shift the kinds of exclusionary migration policies that do not enable refugee young people to either imagine or create opportunities, to engage civically, socially, politically, economically, to do what we hope and they hope that education does enable them to do. A teacher in Beirut, Lebanon, teaching grade 9 Syrian students, said of a curriculum that left no space for refugee students to see themselves in it, said, in the end, nothing of what's in this lesson exists. We wish it does. But the teacher went on, encouraging students about the future. It's true you're learning things that don't exist, but you might be the reason they exist in the future. You might do things related to politics, and you can change and do the things you studied about. The book ends up here on the top of the mountain. And there's an optimism in these ideas that runs quite counter to most of what is written about refugees. I share this optimism because it derives from the people who do the work of refugee education daily, teachers and young people. I find that their optimism is based in not ignoring reality, but instead in being so deeply engaged with it, They experience inequalities at every turn. And so they consider replicating this status quo as really no option at all. Year after year in classrooms and communities, refugee young people and their teachers persist together as they seek and build the kinds of learning and belonging that I think, piece by piece, can enable more peaceful and equitable collective futures for all. And now I am thrilled to introduce Vidor Chopra, who you met earlier right at the beginning. I said earlier in introducing us to the session today that a finding of the book is that building more equitable and just futures happens through dialogue, collaboration, and co-creation. And Vidor is really a vehicle of all of this kind of goodness in the work that he does and how he approaches the world and relationships in it. Vidor is a postdoctoral fellow at Teachers College, Columbia University. And over the past decade, it has been my treat to be able to work with you, Vidor, on research with students and teachers and in co-founding Refugee Reach. Vidor, I'm now passing the baton to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for the opportunity to share time and space with you on your special day. And though I have never felt the thrill of writing a book and sharing it, the closest I have come is my own sort of dissertation, as you remember. And as an international graduate student, the thought of defending my work at my dissertation defense had really crippled me with anxiety. My parents and closest family members who were thousands of miles away at home in India were unable to join given the time difference. But at that time, Sarah, you reassured me when you whispered and you said, look around the room. Yeah, this is the community you have built. Today, as we celebrate your work and you, I hope you will take a moment to look around this virtual room and feel ensconced in the warmth of a community that you have stitched together, one that cherishes and cheers you on. I take the liberty of speaking on behalf of many of your students, some of whom are here today with us, and much of who we are and how we approach our work, our research relationships, and our teaching is owed to you. You have tirelessly reminded us to not throw our hands up in the air in the face of intractable problems, but to instead show up and to engage, even when there are seeming differences of thoughts, opinions, and values. Thank you, Sarah. But as we know through our collaborative endeavors in refugee education, not all teachers and learners are fortunate to have opportunities for supportive mentors and leaders like you. I think of our most recent work in Lebanon, where Syrian refugee learners are temporarily separated from their Lebanese peers and assigned to second shift schools with few, if any, meaningful opportunities to get to know the other. The teachers who teach in these classrooms are all Lebanese nationals who, for the most part, are on short-term contracts paid less than $8 an hour and have often received no targeted professional development or support on how to engage and teach refugee students in languages that are unfamiliar to them, using a curriculum that feels detached from refugee students' everyday realities. Through a year's worth of closely watching, observing, listening, and discerning with grade 9 Syrian students in Lebanon, they tell us that they feel behind, not just temporarily because their schooling is, after all, organized after the Lebanese, but also because they have missed years of schooling to make up for. Catching up, as well as learning the grammar of new and different schools and societies, necessitates targeted support and instruction. In these instances, refugee students want instructional support and relationships with their teachers that are equitable, that are responsive to their needs, and that meets them where they are at, not where an overloaded curriculum or an education system expects where they ought to be. Simultaneously, Syrian refugee students also come to learn that at school they have a shorter instructional day than their Lebanese peers, that their Lebanese peers have opportunities for extracurricular time, that they learn physics and chemistry through its practical applications in the school science laboratory. Opportunities that Syrians as second shift students do not receive. The lack of these opportunities are not new to refugee students as you describe in your book. They in fact mirror the kinds of opportunities that are foreclosed to them in their host societies, such as restrictions to pursue higher education, to gain meaningful employment, and its worst form, restrictions on even the right to the freedom of movement. Students see and live these everyday exclusions. They even internalize it, acknowledging it as a fact and as a given. And as Mira, one participant in our study, noted, there is no country that favors others over their own citizens, right? Our participants tell us that this equality of opportunity is more often than not politically untenable, but some teachers go far to demonstrate that equality of relational treatment is in fact possible, particularly when the same set of care, dignity, belonging, and respect that school systems afford its citizens is also equally extended to those who seek refuge, sanctuary, and exile. And more often than not, it is the teachers who are asked to dance to this tango of equity and equality. On the one hand, from an education system that in principle structurally includes refugees in its schools, but without continued support or supervision for its teachers is unable to realize relational inclusion. And on the other hand, in the classroom, where students whose goals and aspirations are bold, ambitious, and audacious, but who require targeted support to catch up and succeed and not feel behind. Much of my current preoccupation in refugee education hopes to respond to this dilemma, and I hope we will speak about this, of how do we better support our teachers to walk this tightrope of both equity and equality in their pedagogy and instruction. What are the practices that are good and helpful for one that to some extent can perhaps and should indeed be scaled within and across classrooms and schools to be productive for all to learn, to belong, and to flourish. I'd now like to pass it on to my colleague, Dr. Zurra Faizi, who's a lecturer at MIT and a fellow collaborator and co-thinker at the Refugee Reach Initiative. Zurra's steadfast commitments to engendering culturally informed and sustainable educational opportunities for all are visible in her writing and her public engagements. Zurra, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Vidor, for that kind introduction. One of the questions that consumed me, and I believe many students studying education in context of war, is what is the purpose of education in places where children and families are suffering? Should we be focusing on other issues to alleviate the immediate suffering of these children? I'm grateful for the environment Sarah created to mull over these questions and arrive at a place where we appreciate the voices of children and communities who tell us about the importance of education and the need for policies that consider the contextual realities of children. Sarah rarely gives simple answers. As an incisive scholar and educator, she guides her students, tailoring her mentorship and course content to students' interests. At the heart of her teaching is immense trust in students' abilities to arrive at their own understandings and remain open to learning without losing hope. Thank you, Sarah, for trusting us, for continuing to help us make sense of the complex world of children and young people in settings of armed conflict, and for fostering a community where we think together on the limitations and possibilities of education and ensuring that all children know they belong in educational spaces. I study education in Afghanistan, a country that has been devastated by war for over 4 decades, and where education has been used as a political tool to reshape Afghan society. The historical experiences with education, particularly during the 80s, when the communist regime enforced policies such as co-education and Western-styled uniforms threatened local identities and values. Educational policies hence promoted a very confined conception of who belonged and who didn't in schools, in quote unquote modern society and in decision-making spaces. When we study settings of protracted conflict, we must consider these psychological imprints as well as security conditions to understand barriers to education and possibilities. Through my work on community-based education in Kabul, a city of war-displaced families, I learned that establishing security to promote access to schools is insufficient without cultivating safety in schools. Security involves physical well-being from military convoys on the way to school, from bombings, snipers, and drones. Safety involves social well-being in school and in relation to community. It is knowing that your home values are respected, that you can come to school as yourself, that you see yourself reflected in the curriculum and in your teacher, Safety is connected to belonging in school. It is more complex than security as it compels education planners to consider diversity, past experiences, and future prospects. Community-based schools, which are embedded within communities, bridge the cultural gaps between schools and families. I believe much of the success of community-based schools can be attributed to the role of local teachers within these schools. In the classrooms I conducted my research, teachers fostered safety in a number of ways. Teachers were flexible in how students dressed. Some students attended class dressed in colorful clothes, while others wore the black and white school uniform. The head teacher, dressed in traditional Afghan clothes, including a turban, which is uncommon in formal public schools, resembled the way many of the children's fathers and grandfathers dressed. The external markers of safety are further enhanced with learning that reflects home values and experiences. Teachers taught the importance of being a good person through Islamic references about the rights of parents and neighbors. They integrated stories in their pedagogy to draw students' attention and create active learning experiences. Circling back to what is the purpose of education in war, the responses teachers provided highlight conceptions of education that resonate with Afghans. The head teacher remarks, "The goal of education is to live our lives in light, to build a future life, and to educate others. It says in the Quran, someone who doesn't have knowledge is blind. Someone who has knowledge is someone who can see." For me, the delight in students' faces every morning at 8 a.m., their excitement to demonstrate learning in front of their classmates, and their friendships reassured me that all children deserve a place where they can play, learn, and grow. All children have the right to hope and prepare through education for the future as we demand the end to war. I thank Sarah once again for supporting me through a journey that enabled me to arrive at my own understanding, to deepen hope, and to grapple with ways forward. And next, I have the pleasure of introducing my colleague and friend, Celia Reddick. She is a PhD student and soon to be doctor. I have known Celia since she was a master's student at HGSE. She is one of the most diligent and thoughtful scholars I know, motivated by cultivating a better world where all children learn and flourish in ways that are meaningful to them. Celia, it's been an honor to learn with you and be in community with you.
Thank you so much, Zura, for that generous introduction and for the opportunity to join in this conversation with you all. Like Vidor and Zura, before I dive in, I'd like to first reflect on Sarah's extraordinary scholarship, teaching, and mentorship. Sarah did not know that we would each share these reflections, but I hope she feels celebrated today. At the center of Sarah's approach to her work is her ability to engage everyone she encounters, children and teachers in settings around the world, master's and doctoral students at Harvard, senior colleagues, practitioners, policymakers, as colleagues and collaborators in a larger search for understanding. Sarah has developed a global field of refugee education, and as is evident in this conversation and in her approach to teaching and research, she envisions this field as a collaborative movement to improve the lives of children and families globally. At the center of Sarah's path-breaking work is her attention to and the amplification of the experiences of individual children and teachers affected by conflict. This conversation today is just one of many opportunities that Sarah creates for collaboration, making it clear to all of us lucky enough to be her advisees, her students, to learn from her, that we too are members of this collaborative work. Thank you so much for your teaching and for your faith in us, Sarah. With that, I'll continue to reflect on big ideas as Vidor and Zura have done, this time related to understandings of opportunity in refugee education. My research focuses on language in education, in particular among refugee young people in Uganda. I find that in Uganda, English is framed in educational policies and pedagogy as the language of opportunity, but that refugee children and families actually force us to ask what opportunities are meant exactly with this framing. What I actually see in my research is that refugee children and their caregivers yearn for many different kinds of opportunities, for educational and professional opportunities that require English, certainly, but also for opportunities for ongoing connection to people and places of meaning, which require diverse linguistic repertoires, but which often begin to fade in school systems in exile premised on assimilation. For example, Rachel, a 5th grader from South Sudan pursuing education in Kampala, Uganda, was beginning to lose the ability to speak Kakwa, the language she'll need to communicate with her parents, who are still living in South Sudan. During our interview, she reflected, "My parents are there in the village. When I go to meet my parents, which language am I going to speak with them? They don't know English." Nunu, also a 5th grader in Kampala, Uganda, is losing Koalib, the key to her relationship with her beloved grandmother in the Nuba Mountains of Sudan, prompting Nunu to share, "I feel bad. I feel as if I'm not part of the family." Both Rachel and Nunu worry about futures without the opportunity to hold on to and learn from these intergenerational connections. Given this, I wonder about ways to rethink connections between opportunity and language in refugee education, to center not only opportunities to pursue formal employment and schooling, but also relational opportunities across settings and cycles of migration that so many refugee young people experience. I saw teachers working hard to make space for the many languages which children yearn for as they build futures, even though the Ugandan education system pushes toward English. Amani, for example, is a teacher who worked in a school that did not permit languages other than English. And so he explained that he encouraged his students to, quote, to translate, quote, "in your heart or in your mind," as English is just the medium of instruction, but the answering and all the reasoning must originate from what you know. After reading the question, take it back home, he said. This is a small example, but in this approach, Amani sought to create space for children to both strengthen and draw on the linguistic resources they bring to school and to develop the English language skills they need as they build futures in Uganda. In Amani and many other educators, we see glimmers of approaches to language at school that might move away from the idea that English is the language of opportunity, and instead toward a better understanding of the multifaceted opportunities that refugee young people seek, drawing on diverse linguistic resources and ways of knowing as they pursue education and build futures. Thank you.
Thank you, Vidor, Zora, and Celia, both for these inspiring big ideas about really what it would take for learning equity and justice in refugee education. And as you noted, Celia, a surprise to me, but what I saw in what you did showing me that you have relationships deep enough with each other for collective action or a kind of collaborative movement, as you said, Celia, among the three of you to reflect not only on the work that you're doing, but also I think the kinds of pedagogies, relationships, and orientations to teaching and learning that we have tried to co-create as a research community and the teams in which we do research, which I know also really tries to mirror what we see as most promising in our research, in our experience as educators in schools and communities around the world. So we're excited now to enter into more of the discussion phase of our time together today. And I thought we could kick off the conversation among the four of us, and then we'll turn to your questions. So you can please feel free to use the Q&A that you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom screen to enter any questions or ideas that you might like to share with the group. So to kick off our conversation on these big ideas in refugee education, I wanted to reflect on a situation that we see currently unfolding. We've seen more than 4.5 million refugees displaced from Ukraine over the past month. And I think one of the things that has been preoccupying the four of us is that we see a very different kind of educational response for Ukrainian refugees in Europe right now than we have seen in other places in which we work and for other groups of people from other countries of origin in Europe. Some of the elements of this that I hope become precedent in refugee education are around much more open borders, around immediate access to residency permits that allow study and work and some security over the medium term. And also what we seem to be seeing glimmers of abilities for refugee teachers to work in public schools, attention to language in education, and a kind of welcoming stance that I think we see reflected across all 4 of our work, in which schools play a major role. And I'm wondering if we could think together about this question of how what we see now in these educational responses in Europe reflects or doesn't reflect what you have seen in the context of your work, and what we might learn from these examples. Celia, I think you had some thoughts on language related to this, if you wanted to get started.
Of course, thank you so much. Yes, I think, of course, the situation in Ukraine is, I think, reveals many opportunities and real challenges for the education of refugee young people. As you mentioned, Sarah, there does seem to be some openness and willingness to understand the challenges of language for young people entering schools outside of the school systems that they, have attended themselves for years, and even in some cases decades. So thinking, as you've said, about the ways that national teachers, or that refugee teachers might enter into national schools and provide the kinds of linguistic support that are so important for young people to learn, certainly, but also to develop these kinds of relationships and to feel a sense of belonging. I do think that as schools diversify in this way, which we like to think, I think of diversity as really positive, but this is also a real challenge for schools and school systems, that really drawing on the resources of refugee teachers and community members to support children is vital. Thanks.
Thank you, Celia. I wanted to add to the conversation, as we know, schools do not exist in isolation. They are embedded within these broader contexts. And one of the things that I think a lot of people have mentioned is just the different types of coverage that we're seeing around different conflicts around the world. In particular, how Ukraine has been covered versus the war in Afghanistan, for example, or Syria in the Middle East. And to me, this raises, or this connects well to some of the ideas that I shared about security and safety, that children who come to more stable nations might be in an environment where they are more secure. However, these broader conversations and narratives about different religious groups or nationalities can still have an impact on them, and how and their ability to learn and flourish within classrooms. And in particular, I think educators, one of the things that educators can pay attention to is the impact of Islamophobia on children from the Middle East or South Asia, Central Asia. And it's unfortunate, of course, that we do have to live with these broader narratives, and at times there's very little we can do about the media coverage. But I do think that teachers can, through developing relationships with children and trying to learn about their home context, as well as what they believe, what they value, their hopes for the future, that can help us to disconnect individual students and families from these very negative and deficit-based narratives.
Thanks so much, Celia and Zura. I wonder if this connects to a question that I kind of see threaded across our work in this kind of, how do we think about education for refugees and conflict-affected young people that we know over time has really been seen as pretty short-term in focus and focused on access? Kind of, how do we ensure that all displaced young people have access to school, and instead towards some of the kinds of practices and pedagogies and senses of belonging in school that really focus on relationships, on working against the kind of xenophobia and discrimination you described, Zura, against ideas of monolingualism that can often alienate. And I think we've talked, each of us, about some of these ideas of how teachers are working to try to foster these kinds of practices. And I think one of the kind of concerns or worries that I have is how much how much of this responsibility we're placing on teachers, and that teachers are daily trying to do this work in such strong capacities and are building these kinds of relationship with students that are really hard and often put teachers at risk. And what are we asking of education systems in that way? And I think, Vidor, this comes back to what you were saying too, also about what are the kinds of practices that might scale and how could we scale them? And I wonder if this is something that we keep our eye on in some way in the current response to Ukrainian refugees in Europe, where this kind of immediate sense of opening systems and thinking about a systemic response that would include all Ukrainian refugees and enable this kind of learning in different languages, and what that means over the longer term in terms of what responsibilities teachers are taking and needing to take, and what can be supported by school leaders, by district leaders, by an infusion of different kinds of resources that teachers might need in that context. I don't know if anyone wants to reflect on any of those ideas.
Yeah, I'd just like to sort of start, and hopefully this can bring all of us into the conversation as well. So I think, with regards to Ukraine, also as we look at this idea of opening up systems and what does that mean, and will this last? I think some of this is also linked to, again, a pretty short-term horizon of 1 year of sort of saying, where the EU has granted temporary protection to all Ukrainians. And so as a consequence of that, they have access to education and the kinds of supports that Ukrainian children need right now. I think with regards to teachers, right, I think one thing that at least one of the many things that my work has taught me is of how contextualized pedagogy is and how contextualized it and adaptive it needs to be. And so when we think of just like broad one size sort of fit all kind of approaches of saying, this practice is culturally responsive or not, right? That doesn't quite work. So I think of the teacher in Lebanon whose social civics class we sat in on, time and again, and use the same strategy of sort of dividing the class into teams, getting them to sort of rote memorize, come onto the board, write, and sort of just engaging students in a quiz of sorts, right? And pitting the two teams against the other and trying to make learning a little more playful and engaging. Now, when my research colleague and I were looking at this pedagogy and observing this classroom, we got really bored. We saw this the first time and we're like, oh, wow, this is something new and different. But when we saw it the second and the third and the fourth time, after a point, it just got boring to us. And when we actually interviewed that teacher and asked about this pedagogical decision, one of the things that, this teacher turned around and said totally blew us away and surprised us and said, well, I know that my students cannot learn at home. They do not have electricity at home. They're living in overcrowded spaces, and the opportunity and time to learn at home is really little. So the 40 minutes that I have right now is the only way I can ensure that they actually learn the content that they need to learn to be able to pass this very high stakes examination that determines their future education pathways. Now, that teacher could do that, could engage in that pedagogical style because his broader school environment and the school leaders enabled that sort of flexibility and that autonomy. We know that teachers are also in school systems that are highly structured, where the exercise of that autonomy is not possible, or where there is this great degree of standardization, as you draw out in your book, Sarah, this tension between standardization and autonomy, and what is teachers' roles in that. So I think that is really where I'm at in thinking about, what is it that we have lost as we have gone to this greater degree of standardization or this sort of blanket approach to inclusion, and what do we see in sort of non-formal spaces of education that offer glimmers of hope, and where children can feel that they're learning, that they have a sense of belonging and connection.
What great ideas and thinking about this, not only what is, but what can be, I think, Vidor, and these kinds of examples from classrooms. And I just reflect methodologically too in what you were saying of sometimes we make assumptions about the kinds of pedagogies teachers might use, and we observe, and then we experience it in a certain way. And then you just pointed to a whole new kind of realization that happens when you ask a teacher why they have engaged in certain kinds of pedagogies and have ongoing relationships with students to understand how they are experiencing those pedagogies as well. We'd love to turn to your questions now, and we see a few coming into the Q&A, and do feel free to add any other questions in there. I wanted to start and just thank you, Muhumure, for joining. You noted that you yourself are a refugee from Congo living in Kenya, and also a teacher. And would love to learn more from your experiences of doing this work, and engaging with your students in this kind of future building through education as you've engaged in yourself. I see a question that came in earlier from Julie. Thanks so much for this question. You're asking how we conceptualize home in our work. I'll just say a few things about that and then open it up for anyone else who might like to say something. The passage that I read from Jacques before has really shaped my way of thinking about home. I think I used to think of home as a pretty static, geographic type place, and learned in my work with Jacques and with other refugee teachers and students of this real fluidity and the idea that home can be created. And sometimes that's not the home that any of us is looking for or imagining, but the kind of steps in terms of thinking about what are the elements of feeling like one belongs in a place, as Jacques had said in that passage, of feeling like one can really be oneself, like the future can be imaginable. I think those are the real kind of tenets and criteria that I'm thinking about when I think about home.
Thank you so much for this question, Julie, and Sarah, for getting us started thinking about it. I similarly, as I mentioned, my focus is really on issues of language, and I found that children and families were also not necessarily articulating home as a geographic location. Of course, in some instances, there's a real desire to return to Sudan or South Sudan in the case of children and families I was working with in Uganda. But there's also a real understanding of this sort of pursuit of opportunity, as I mentioned, that is rooted in relationships, and a sense of belonging and home in relationships. So in friendships with other Ugandan children, in relationships with Ugandan teachers, and also in the ability to kind of maintain really important relationships of meaning from the past. So I found that the children and families I was speaking with helped me to reconceptualize this as well, shifting from a focus on place to really a focus on relationships of meaning. Thanks.
Yeah, I wanted to add to this as well. It's a beautiful question, and I've thought about it a lot, and I think there's so many. I have a feeling that my answers will change as I get older. And it already has. I draw on my own experiences of moving to the US, growing up here, and as well as the experiences of my participants in answering this question. I think as a child, for me, home was always Afghanistan. And even the children that I grew up with, my friends and their younger siblings who had never seen Afghanistan, they would always say, well, of course, we're from Afghanistan. And I think the older I've gotten, that conception of home has become more complex, and I've realized that home can be built anywhere in the world. However, I also think the connection to the original home, or to the first place that you consider home, never goes away. And I saw this in my participants as well, that I did my work in Kabul, where the vast majority of my participants were internally displaced. And I asked them about what they considered, actually, I didn't ask them any questions, but this emerged through our conversations, that many of these children would use the word homeland, which in Farsi and Pashto is Watan, to mean their original village, and as someone who grew up in the US, Wethan to me always meant Afghanistan, the whole country. And yet to these children, it meant their specific village. And so I think even though there are possibilities to create a new home and to create many homes, that there's always something that connects us back to our original Wethans.
I don't know if it was obvious on Zoom, but I'm always with my pencil taking notes on new learnings from each of you. I wonder if this discussion connects in some ways to a few questions that we had in the Q&A about this process of, for teachers and students, of integrating, assimilating, becoming part of a new school system. And one of the reflections that I have on what we just talked about in terms of home, and you said so beautifully, Zura, is this sense that a connection to original home, wherever that is, whatever that is, geographic, place-based. I see most school systems globally not set up to really recognize that and to engage with that sense of transnational living, not only in the past, but also in the present, and of this real connection between students' identities that they are bringing to the classroom, that we hope that they will not need to leave outside that public space, but instead feel like it can be a part of and can be included in that. And I think some of the questions that Vidor Chopra and Chris are asking around these challenges of teachers to really not only teach within a formal curriculum that has been prescribed to them and that they are expected to teach, but to open up these spaces that may feel both very risky because they may be politically charged, but also really, really challenging to do in the absence of deep relationships sustained over time and with so much care and attention. So I hope these are real questions in many ways that we can come back to, that you've raised in the Q&A and that we're excited to engage in ongoing conversations about. I don't know if there are any other reflections on this idea that anyone else would like to bring in before we conclude.
I would just say quickly, I think the role of systems supporting the teachers a whole lot better, right? So yes, the teachers do need to form the kinds of deep relationships that we're speaking about, but I think often systems fall really short in helping teachers do the work that they need to do in their classrooms to help refugee children, and I mean all children, learn well. So really thinking from a systems perspective, what does that mean, as well as the politics of that's embedded in any sort of reform around teachers, teacher support and well-being.
So as we wrap up today, I hope that this opens more questions and more impetus to engage in the kinds of discussions that I think are really essential in terms of being able to work together to attempt to act on and create more just and equitable futures with refugee young people. So I just wanted to extend such a deep thanks and appreciation, Vidor, Zura, and Celia, to you, and hope that all of you who joined today will engage in more of these kinds of conversations. We have other conversations related to themes of the book upcoming, and everyone is welcome. So thanks again for joining today, and Mayan, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, everyone. I dropped the link where you can find a recording of this book talk. And thank you for this really engaging and interesting and important conversation. Thank you.